Dane Bagley.
Kevin Shibley.
Well, here we are again. Episode
Yep.
16 of the Asynchrony podcast. And
Week 16, 4 months
this is
in.
going to be an exciting one.
Yeah. It's about to get real.
Exactly. In a very real way. And about that, right from the start, when we started doing this, 15 weeks ago, or 16 weeks ago, rather. Actually 17, I think, because we skipped a week there. But when we first started doing this, right early on, as we started to analyze our transcripts and go back through some of the episodes, we started seeing that at some point we were going to need to address some really tough issues and be able to apply some of the things that we were learning along the way, right? And one of the things that some of our analysis pointed to very directly early on was being able to address issues like the COVID pandemic and all of the things that came out of that, not just as far as medical issues and, the truth of the science and things, but also what it did to our society, right? And the divisions and everything that were caused around it, right?
Right. And I mean, I want to point out that what I always wanted to do with this, and I think you've been in agreement with me on this, is that I felt like before we could actually look at anything in the real world, we needed to construct an analytical toolkit that we would be able to apply to any subject that would have stripped out as much as possible our individual biases, that when we applied that to something, we would have confidence in the results that we got back, whether it confirmed or challenged what we believed going in. So
Right.
I think that was really important, because otherwise we just fall into the arguing, well, this is what I believe. No, this is what I believe. And, we need that, common structure in being able to look at things. And I think that one of the things the analysis had told us, and that we've agreed, it's kind of developed organically, is that we've gotten to the point where we have a prototype on that we feel like will actually serve the purpose. I don't think it's done. I think there's a lot of stuff in today, that theoretically we're going to get to today that will be incorporated into that toolkit. But I think we've touched on a lot of the ideas that we need and a lot of the concepts that we need to keep in mind when we're analyzing information. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, we've talked about finding truth. And I mean, that's what we're interested in, but I don't, to categorize that in a way that I think will be more accessible to people, we're not going to find truth. I mean, truth is something that we're all trying to explore. What we're trying to do is develop a way of looking at things that primarily is going to flag and eliminate untruth, separate signal from the noise, to be able to then look at things and, have the discussions that need to be had to make the honest assessments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really a method of being able to discuss these things, right? Because that's the first step. If we can't actually discuss these things objectively and without our own biases getting in the way and keeping us apart, then we're really not going to have any kind of a productive discussion, right, on any subject.
It's one of these things that I've been seeing for years that frustrates me to no end. And I don't, this is like the only way that I can think of to get past it. But I've seen numerous subjects. I mean, COVID is one of them. I raised the idea earlier of like, so how is California?
Right.
One that we had talked about a couple of years ago, which is constantly in the zeitgeist, which is never agreed upon, is the economy. So it's like there are these things, and the
Or the
point
role of
is that
government or all these
yeah,
things, right?
the
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
is that we don't have the ability to do an objective analysis and determine what has worked, what hasn't worked, and be able to build on that. It all just gets caught up in the division, and you know we can't figure anything out. I mean, so we'll keep doubling down on bad policy because it reflects the team jersey, as opposed to trying to figure out what is actually going to accomplish the goals that if we looked at it, we would all pretty much agree on.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, and it also prevents us from being honest with ourselves, right? Because it prevents us from when we do realize something that was a mistake, especially if it's something that we made as a mistake or somebody on our side of things, right? Our team made, then it's very difficult to be able to admit to that because it's shown as a sign of weakness and surrender, right? To the other side. And rather than actually being able to work through it. And also that on the reciprocal side, that desire to kind of stick your finger in their face and say, see, I told you so, right? And instead of actually being gracious and saying, okay, I'm glad that you were able to come to that realization, right?
Got on the libs. Here's my mug of liberal tears.
Exactly. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, it's that whole thing. And I was telling you before we got started, I went down a rabbit hole this week, and this may be an interesting topic to actually look into next week.
Hmm. Yep.
I'll be pulling in some elements of my research and analysis as we go through that. But I started with um the idea for the whole podcast was division, and
Right.
where's the division coming
Asynchrony. Yeah.
from?
Yep.
What has divided us? And so, one of the things that we keep coming back to that we've kind of thrown out just descriptively and haven't really gotten into um scientifically is the whole in group out group dynamic,
Right. Yep.
which if you follow that back to you know anthropologically, as far as we can go, is really just a threat assessment tool.
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
we determined very early on, you know, maybe around the time of developing language, or maybe even before that, that we needed to be able to distinguish our tribe, which at that point was a family group, which you know, so there's
Right.
a lineage aspect to that.
Yep.
Um,
Safety from danger. Right. Yep.
Yeah, to
Exactly.
differentiate someone who's from outside of that represents a potential threat. We were talking about Haidt's work on moral judgments, which is,
Right. Which
if
will
you
come into
accept
play
his,
here too. Yep.
yeah, if you accept his theory that it's instinctual, all of that instinctual stuff is basically just threat assessment. So,
Right.
starting there,
Baked
going
in.
through the binaries that we see in all kinds of things, um, looking into that in the context of um, assigned and assumed identity characteristic binaries, um, cult dynamics, and then finally ending up at COVID to get ready for the discussion today. But
Right.
there's a lot of information in there that echoes and provides deeper explanation for a lot of things that we've talked about.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why COVID as an issue to discuss in our project here is so perfect, right? Because it's an issue that when it was going on, when it actually first hit, nobody really had all the answers, right? Nobody, including all the smartest, most trained epidemiologists, doctors, scientists, everybody, nobody had the answers, right? So everybody along the way was kind of trying to figure it out as we went along. Along the way, it got politicized, obviously. And that made it even harder to find out what was actually true and what was false. And now, in retrospect, it's continuing to make it difficult to talk about, right? It's continuing to make it difficult to be able to even go back and do a real, honest postmortem on the issue because we're now so baked into our positions on one team or the other.
Let me read the first point on the analysis that I did here, because I think it really frames all of that out nicely. I do need to introduce one concept before I read that, so it'll make sense, which is something you wrote a piece on this week, and talked to me about. So one of the aspects that I tied into that, if we're looking at dichotomies, we've talked about dichotomy with a moral judgment attached.
Right.
Um,
And a dualism. Yeah.
yeah, a term that gets used for that is being Manichaean, or
Right.
Manichaeism, which I mean, you researched that this week. Do you want to give a thumbnail on that?
Just real quick. Yeah. I mean, basically, there was a guy named Mani, or however you want to pronounce it, Mani, and he lived in what is now the Iraq area. And he lived a couple hundred years, almost 300 years after Jesus, right, in the first few centuries CE, or Common Era. And he decided that he would create a religion. I mean, sometimes it's revealed wisdom that people try to purport as their basis for a religion. This guy had no qualms about just saying, I'm just going to make something up, right? I'm going to make a religion. And he was pretty successful, surprisingly so. He wrote his own scripture, and his Manichaeanism, or Manichaeism, is became a religion all from Rome, all the way, the Roman Empire, actually, all the way to China. And it lasted for some 14, 15, 1600 years, right? I mean, it was pretty successful. It competed against Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and Sufism and all kinds of other world religions. And although it did die out, it left kind of imprints kind of everywhere that it touched, right? It kind of left a kind of a residual thought process and ideas behind, as any religion would, right?
Right.
So that's just kind
So
of the
correct me
brief
if I'm wrong here, but
history.
the basic tenet of Manichaeanism, or however you say that,
Manichaeism, I
yeah,
guess is what, yeah,
is the thought that everything breaks down to a conflict between good and evil.
right.
It's all
And
black
it's a
and white.
balance concept. It's like two gods, basically, right?
Yeah.
There's a good God and a bad God.
Yeah. So I mean, and everything fits within that framework. So
Right. Black and
applying
white.
that, yeah, applying that to, in group, out group analysis, and, you know, it's the moral judgment aspect of our moral judgment dualities that we've been talking about. So
Exactly.
that is, a moral judgment duality is what that is. That's a
Right.
Manichaean perspective.
Right.
So, the first section that it gave me here, let me read this. It says the meta problem, analyzing COVID through a framework that COVID distorted.
Mm,
Before mapping the theoretical framework onto COVID, we need to acknowledge a genuine epistemological difficulty. The Manichaean, cultic, and totalizing dynamics we've described did not just accompany the COVID crisis. They actively shaped what information was produced, how it was evaluated, what was suppressed, what was amplified, and how institutions responded. This means that the evidentiary record itself is contaminated by the dynamics that we're trying to analyze. This is not a reason for nihilism or conspiracy thinking. It's a reason for calibrated epistemic humility. The recognition that on this particular topic, across the entire spectrum, from institutional mainstream to heterodox dissent, motivated reasoning was operating at maximum intensity.
yes.
And that distinguishing signal from noise requires unusual care. The framework that we've built, which I'd like to go over in more detail later on, actually helps here because it gives us diagnostic tools for identifying when a position, regardless of its content, is being held and communicated in cultic or Manichaean ways.
Right.
Independent of whether the underlying claim is true or false, the manner of holding a belief is partially diagnostic of whether it is being held well, even when it cannot tell us definitively whether the belief is correct.
Right. Right. Yep. Exactly. Well, that's a great place to start.
I felt
Because,
like that
yep,
did a great job of summing up this whole thing as to
it
the
really does.
landmines that we're trying to walk through.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think I think you're right to call them landmines, right? Because they basically block our passage, right? They prevent us from getting to where we're trying to go.
Right.
So, when we want to talk about something like COVID, and you raised the issue of motivated reasoning, that's probably one of the first things that we always have to look for, isn't it? When we're testing any kind of claim that anybody makes, whether it's an expert talking about epidemiology and infection rates or whatever, or it's just, somebody that you're talking to that's trying to decide whether or not to go get the vaccine. for themselves, right? And however we talk about those things, we have to be very careful of whether or not we're using motivated reasoning or principled reasoning, right? And
Right.
principled reasoning is much more objective, something where we really look at the facts, look at what is, and not only just what it ought to be,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Or
you
what we
know,
think ought to be, because we're motivated to think that way.
you know, and, I didn't get this up until right before we got on. So I know you haven't had a chance to look at it yet.
Mhm.
Maybe if you have an opportunity to glance over it later, maybe we think about even attaching this to the video when it comes out, as kind of an analysis of all of these things. I mean, that's one of the things that it does. When I had Claude do the analysis, I wanted to make sure that everything was done, um, book matched and mirrored, so that we looked at both sides, and it does a really good analysis of analyzing the motivated reasoning on both sides.
Right. Right. And we'll talk about some specific areas where we have identified that type of motivated reasoning.
Right.
So, as we look at this issue, perhaps the best place to start, and this is what we've talked about before in some of our earlier episodes, is to be able to make sure that we know what is, right? What happened, what we can actually agree on happened. I mean, first of all, I don't think either of us are going to try to argue that COVID didn't exist, right? There was certainly
Right.
a
Yeah,
virus.
there was a virus that circulated the world, which both of the prevailing, origin stories agree basically that it originated in the vicinity of a city in China called Wuhan.
Wuhan, right?
Um,
Yep.
so
Yeah,
there
that's
was a
one thing
vi-
we all agree on. It pretty much
yeah,
started there.
yeah, there was a virus that circulated the world called SARS-CoV-2, which was commonly referred to as COVID-19.
Right. Well,
Um,
COVID-19 is the disease it caused, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, fair enough. Um, yeah, so that happened.
Right. Yeah. So we know that happened. We know that large number of people were infected. We know that.
Right.
We know that some number of people, and I'm being very careful about saying some number, um, of people died either as a result or uh, as a complication with other comorbidities, right? That caused them to be deceased.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
and I want to go back to the idea that, in that paragraph that I just read, that talked about the fact that this is going to be difficult to analyze because the information that we need to do the analysis was polluted by the situation this was
right.
in. So
Absolutely.
we can agree to a point on different things, and especially things that have been agreed to, where whoever's talking about it has kind of changed their opinion on it. I think that always gives a little more validity if you've revised your position on something. So the you know the point being that, yeah, I mean, we can throw out numbers, but the numbers are going to be disputed. But kind of somewhat general percentages and ratios and that type of, you're going to have a little more accuracy if you're looking at
Right.
things that way.
Absolutely. And by the way, I should add that even though we may not be able to definitively prove any of these numbers or ratios, I don't think anybody can, because there's still a wide ranging debate, even at the highest professional and expert levels on the exact numbers. But we do understand that those numbers, and at least the magnitudes of those numbers, are important when we're making decisions, right, about things, and when we're making decisions about policy, when we're making decisions about social values and cultural values. They're not irrelevant, even though we can't really pin them down to an exact.
Yeah, I mean, it's my perception is that anytime that you're in a position to be making policy decisions, you need to consider the proportion of people that the proportion of people that this is addressed to versus the proportion of people that are going to be impacted by it.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah. And basically, the issue has kind of illuminated several areas of disagreement, right? Areas where um, the two sides, and because everything has been politicized at this point into that dualism of right versus left or liberal versus conservative, right? Or at least in our country, in our
Right.
society today. Um, and the things that really we got divided on, I mean, first of all, you already mentioned the origin of the virus. We all agree it came from Wuhan, China, but there is still significant debate about whether or not it was a lab leak, either purposeful or accidental. I mean, there's another layer of question to that as well, or if it was something that simply jumped from animal to human, right? In what they call a zoonotic spillover, right?
Right.
An
And
animal to human transmission. And
my
just to finish that thought, the this is important. I mean, it's always important to try to figure out where something like this came from and why, especially if we can find some kind of malfeasance or purposeful harm. But we also know that has not been there are arguments for both sides, but has not still to this day been definitively resolved.
right. So my position on that kind of has always been, you know, for me personally, that doesn't make any difference. I understand the importance of where it came from is for people who are studying the virus to be able to help them get a better idea of, how it originated, how it developed, and that all impacts how to treat it. So, for most of us, if you're not, actively involved in, you know, virology or developing treatments on that, it really doesn't matter. And it all, from my perspective, it only became important and started to matter when the institution, when the Overton narrative said that you can only talk about one of these possible origins
Right, right, and yeah, and it became dogmatized, right?
very
In terms
quickly.
of
Yeah.
an official narrative and an orthodoxy and a heterodoxy, right? Very quickly, which complicates things because if you start there and we already get divided on just how it started, then everything downstream of that gets polluted, right? Every part of the discussion gets polluted, and trust starts to break down.
Right. And, I mean, I find it really interesting. And this is one of the things that people look at a lot. Um, the reason the reason that there became an orthodoxy and a dogma on that started very quickly with people who were involved in the research making pronouncements. They were also the people that were tasked with investigation. So um you had the most significant example was the treatment of the laboratory leak hypothesis, which in February 2020, a letter organized by Peter Daszak from EcoHealth Alliance was signed by 27 scientists in the Lancet, declared that scientists strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. So it was
Right.
labeled with that pejorative of this is a conspiracy theory. It was put out by a scientist who, or someone involved in the institutional apparatus that was, if it was a lab leak, involved in the development of it.
Well, and you talk about very often the idea of you know alert notifications, right? These things that jump out at us, and a fact that we know, then we can't necessarily say that this is 100% damning in terms of its convincing, being convincing or not. But the person that you meant, Peter Deszak, actually did work for EcoHealth Alliance, right? And EcoHealth Alliance did receive funding and work with these epidemic and scientists and things in this lab in Wuhan, China, right? So if we wanted to look at whether or not he was using motivated reasoning in his basically saying that this is just all conspiracy theory hype, right? And nutcase stuff, then we would see right away that there is a valid concern about the potential, at least, for motivated reasoning because he has skin in the game, right? In terms of whether or not it leaked from this lab that he and his association worked in.
Yeah, I believe it's called concept called CYA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, yeah, sure. Yeah, and this happens all the time. At the same time, we also have in our intelligence infrastructure, right, with the CIA. And by the way, funnily enough, the CIA and the FBI right now currently both hold differing opinions, right, on this, right? So at least
How
officially, at least
unu-
what they say, right? Yeah,
how unusual.
right, exactly. So, but I mean, one other area where there is legitimate concern for motivated reasoning is in the fact that I'm sure the CIA does not want everybody around the world, and particularly those people in China, to know exactly how closely they are monitoring the research that's going on in China, right? So there is a little bit of another, not only CYA, but, you know, cover our methodology as well,
Yeah,
right?
and I mean there are legitimate questions to on both sides of all of that. That we there are intelligence concerns, especially with that being in a foreign country, and that foreign country being one of our primary adversaries. There's a lot of stuff that needs to really needs to not be disturbed there, and a lot of that got brought in. Um, and there was a lot of that type of thing. But when there the term that he used in the letter is something that we talked about early on, and we talked about it early on because it plays into almost everything. Um, and I wanted to use this as an opportunity to introduce something else that I thought of this week that I had mentioned to you earlier. And that's conspiracy theories. And I had told you when I was thinking about this earlier that I've there's an element in thinking about conspiracy theories that there's been a dark matter hole in my understanding of how people are seeing that. Because when we talked about it, we talked about top down versus bottom up. When a lot of people would throw out, conspiracy theories, it always really confused me, and it confused me when people would do the push back on it against conspiratorial thinking, and I would be like, What are you talking about?" So I had this idea earlier this week that occurred to me, and I'm going to throw this in here to add to the toolkit. Um, so it's a word that spell check is apparently telling me that I invented because it doesn't like it. Um, and that would be the title of Conspiracism, which is obviously the you know inclination to look at things in terms of a conspiracy
Right. The
theory.
tendency,
So
right? Yeah.
so the
Kind of a
element that
pre-built
I
tendency.
yeah, the element that I determined what I was missing on that gave me the definition. So, conspiracism is the process of attempting to determine who is to blame.
Right.
More
Right.
specifically, conspiracism is the process of attempting to blame a recognized outgroup for a negatively perceived event.
Right. Right. Exactly. And by the way, this is also how it can be used in a manipulative way, right? Because if we're trying to place the blame, anytime we're trying to place the blame, we're trying to place the blame on somebody else, right? Not on us, right? We're not admitting to anything. We're actually doing exactly the opposite. We're blaming somebody else for the problem.
Yeah, I mean it suggested something that I see almost universally in almost all high profile events, which is that the idea that if blame can be placed on the negative pole of a moral duality, the entire explanation confirms the confirmation bias position is correct. Um, so that everything automatically gets fit into that framework of, well, the people who did this are the bad people, and they're responsible because they're bad people. And
Right.
you
Right.
saw this in all of the COVID conspiracies. It was those evil tech people with their 5G towers, or it was that evil Bill Gates that wanted to put microchips in everyone, or it was the one that I never got where they were just blaming Chinese people. Well, it's they're
Right.
our adversaries. Those evil Chinese people that are behind this, and yeah, so it's that occurred to me in thinking about all this. It was like, okay, Okay, I understand that perspective now, but that's very different from, well, was this lab involved,
Right,
or,
right,
is this person who was involved, you know, in the funding side of the lab trying to deflect attention from, there are legitimate questions in there that got lumped in then with the
right.
conspiracy, which is,
Yep.
kind of
Yep.
the basis of why we talked about it in the first place.
And then it can be used politically as well, right? I mean, obviously, there were a lot of the lab leak theory really got latched onto by Republican politicians who wanted to use it to basically shame the Biden Fauci administration, right? And basically kind of, throw it all on them. And what it comes down to when we really want to evaluate whether this Peter Daszak from Echo Health is using motivated reasoning, or politicians of one side or the other are using motivated reasoning, it really comes down to a simple question. And that question is, if the evidence pointed the other way, would you accept it? Right? Would you change your
Right.
position? And if the answer is no, then chances are you're using motivated reasoning.
Right. There's another concept that we've talked about that I feel like is important to consider in there too, because you're looking at, you know, differences of opinion. There are a lot of instances, and it doesn't universally apply, but there are a lot of things where you can look at that where it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And motivated reasoning in this topic is one of those that, especially in the analysis I did, really shows up, in mirror images. It's not that one side was using it, it's that both sides were
Right.
using it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for example, the idea of the 6 foot rule, right? Of staying 6 feet apart, right? And
Uh-huh.
we know now, obviously Fauci gave his testimony before the Congress and basically admitted that, that the actual number of 6 feet wasn't ever tested, right? There wasn't like any kind of like test that 2 feet is worse than 6 feet is better than, or 10 feet is better than six. You know what I mean? They didn't really go through any type of methodological evaluation of it. It was just, let's just keep people apart. 6 feet sounds right. But then once you say that and it becomes policy, and then once institutions start to drive policy and commit to those policies of that 6 foot standard, then the motivated reasoning really comes in hard and fast to try to justify and make sense of why we've chose 6 feet, right?
I I think from what I've seen that there were logistical concerns that kind of settled on that number. But do you know where that whole idea comes from?
Where's that?
It was a science project done by the 14-year-old daughter of a an administrator in one of the health agencies.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's that's an interesting side note. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
So, but
well,
yeah,
and
but I mean that it does show the kind of arbitrariness, right, of it.
yeah,
However,
these
and
are
he
all the
admitted to
kind
that.
these are all the kinds of things that came out during that. And the people that were the rational dissent, they would find these things out and they'd be like, wait a minute, the guy that said that this was a conspiracy theory was paying for the research,
Right.
and this idea that they're holding us all to came from a 14-year-old science project. And I mean, there's actual information that came out, and then the institutional side just, so
Yeah.
that was reinforced, with all of that. But again, trying to maintain the impartiality on that, it was met with equal further fervor by other things on the other side.
Well, that's the problem, right? Because the real gas on the fire isn't the disagreement, right? The
Right.
real gas on the fire is the dogmatization of it, and to say that we can't even have the discussion. The Overton window is closed, right? And we're not going to allow to even entertain the idea that there might be an alternate narrative or an alternate explanation. I mean, that
So
that really exacerbates the problem.
I'm going to throw this in here. There was a term that I found in, I think this comes out of the cult research. Um, but it's the term of self-sealing frameworks, um, that interpret all evidence as confirmation. So That's that idea that nothing from the outside, everything from the inside. And if you get conflicting evidence from the outside, it's a Kafka trap.
Right.
It's just proof that it's wrong.
Yeah. So there are a number of other things that we can apply when we want to apply our toolkit to this application. We talked about motivated versus principled reasoning. Another is to make sure that when we're talking about these things, we're really doing the scrutiny. We're using scrutiny that is symmetric. We don't want to use asymmetric scrutiny tests, right? And what I mean by that is, would we apply the same evidentiary standard if it supported the other conclusion, right? The opposite or the other idea, whether it's the orthodoxy or the heterodoxy. And that's really important when we apply to COVID, because the asymmetries were pervasive in the way that people analyze the different disagreements. Where, and for masking, I mean, masking may be the best result because even the WHO and the CDC reversed their own position, right? Originally, they said they weren't going to recommend people wearing masks. And he even cited evidentiary evidence why masks would not be useful in this situation. Of course, then
Yeah.
the guidance reversed, and it did so. I mean, you could make the argument it did so because they learned more information, but that does not help in terms of building trust with people and making sure that people know that your motivations are principled, not. I mean, your reasoning is principled, not motivated.
Right. Yeah, I remember, and this was kind of always a sticking point for me. Uh, my wife works in senior living. So it was, from day one, it was well known that this was primarily an illness of the elderly. So, she was on the front lines of, needing to know things and looking into things. So before masking even became a question, I remember in probably the first half of, it was definitely within March of
Mhm.
2020.
Very early
Um,
on. Yep.
yeah, it was very early on when there were people on the internet that were like, well, do you think it would help to wear masks or whatever? She's very good at doing internet research. So she got online at that point and did a little research on that. And she showed me an article that said, you know, it was a research conclusion. It said testing has been done on this and masking does not have a significant impact on respiratory viruses.
Transfer. Right. Right. Okay.
So,
Yeah, and
so
and that's the important part because in science, one of the core principles of any kind of scientific research, and probably the most important tool, is randomized controlled tests, right?
right. And so
And
this was
yep,
citing that, and it was before it got politicized. So I
yes,
always had that in the back of my mind throughout the whole thing. I'm like, no, and it's funny because like I was never able to find that article again.
right,
So,
right.
that's kind of potentially an information scrub example or whatever, but people weren't reporting finding those types of things once it got politicized.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And what they were using instead, and this is what makes it an asymmetric scrutiny test rather
Mhm.
than a symmetric scrutiny test, is because instead of using the RCT or randomized controlled testing that science depends on, it was really using a precautionary principle and what we call analogical evidence, right? We were using analogies like, for example, I remember people using the analogy that if we're both not wearing pants and one of us pees, we're both going to get wet, right? And that's an analogical evidence to say that masks are going to prevent us from spreading this disease, right?
And and that is the level of analysis that we were, and it's like if you could take a step back and pull yourself out of the conflict, you just look at the level analysis because that was the one side, and the other side was, well, if you fart, can you smell it through your jeans? I mean,
Right,
so
exactly.
so it's like this is the
So
level
now
we're
we got
operating
peeing and
on.
farting. Yeah,
Yeah, we're 10-year-olds.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's the thing. If you're going to demand a randomized controlled test on one side, you have to demand it on the other to make sure that you're really talking about apples to apples, right? That's the
Right.
important thing. Yeah.
And there were these videos floating around. I mean, I remember seeing one that's, an infrared video of someone passing gas, and you can see the cloud behind him. And
You
it's
see
like,
the cloud behind him, right?
yeah, it's like,
Exactly. Yeah.
and there you go. And, but,
Well, that
and
proves
then,
it.
yeah. And then, and then there were plenty of other things on the other side. And then you get into people who are trying to do actual analysis where you're looking at a comparison of, a virus particle size versus a bacteria, which is 200 times larger or something, and then comparing that to like the weave, and and you get people who are like, okay, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but if you blow that up like microscopically, you're spraying a garden hose through a chain link fence.
Right. And remember that, when we talk about masks, I mean, there was a wide disparity of the types of masks people were using, right? I mean, you went all the way from the real, what are the N95, 95 or whatever,
N95
right?
respirators.
Respirators, right? And
Yeah.
all the way down to just, basically cut up rags that people sewed together to make, to make masks, right? Of various different types of material and different types of densities and things. So there wasn't very much scientific in terms of the types of masks we were choosing to wear. That's certainly true.
Right. And I mean, to add to that, there were no official recommendations.
Right.
You just
Right.
had to have something covering your face.
Right. And
So,
the other problem to that though is that it did it did kind of work in a way of putting, it's like we talk about the team jerseys, right? And having the labels on the team jerseys of who, who your sponsors are and what
uh-huh.
you believe kind of thing. Well, the mask became kind of that, didn't it? Because, people who didn't want to be associated with the other side would not wear the mask because that was like an indication that they were submitting, right, to the authority or to the um to the tyranny, right?
Right.
They were surrendering to the tyranny. And it was a
Yeah.
very visible recognition of that.
And there are still people doing it.
Yeah. And also people who were wearing masks who were using it as kind of an outward show of their moral superiority, right? It was
Well, yeah,
performative in a lot of ways.
that's that's what I was talking. Yeah, there are still people walking around in masks, and
Right.
I
Sure.
think that they feel like that there's. I don't know what the motivation behind that is. I mean, for people who are elderly and concerned about their health, I don't know that it's actually doing any good, but if it makes them feel better, fine. But I think there are also people that are still virtue signaling with that too, that they're
Yeah,
on
total
the.
virtual signaling. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing that we talk about with our toolkit is um, we have to make sure that we're separating what is the case. That's why we started with the what is real. What can we agree on that actually happened, right? We have to make sure that we separate factual claims from what we should do about it, right? Which is more of a value claim, right? Because and the problem is that, as we discussed in one of our previous episodes, is that we don't always have the same basis, even intuitionally, right? Even at the instinctual level, we don't always have the same basis with each other of making value judgments, right? And so that's going to make policy and making the decisions of what we do about it very difficult, especially if we can't already have agreed upon what actually is the case, the factual claim, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's, that was one of the things um when we talked about height and the righteous mind, and I was
Right.
trying to
Yep.
find, go back to those um
Yeah, like
axes. I
care
had
was one of them, fairness. And I think this really plays a major role in this discussion in terms of COVID, because I think people on the left, people like me, right, on the left, who really just basically use the care and fairness value axes, right, to make our value judgments. Those are basically the primary ones we use uh, from a more liberal mindset. Um, this was all about care, right? Care and fairness. When in fact, it was a moral outrage when somebody didn't follow the guidelines because they were being unfair. They were putting other people at risk selfishly, and they were being at risk, so therefore it violated our care harm axis, right, as well. So
Yeah, and
it,
that
and it became a very moral issue.
that whole concept really it helped me understand that a lot better.
Yep.
Is
Yep.
I had not been aware or had not, considered that in my thinking, that there are different axes that people are looking at that on, and that some people have more axes available than
Right.
others.
Right, where
And
the
that's
conservative mindset uses all six, right, which also
right.
includes things like liberty versus oppression, or authority versus rebellion, right? Or uh, purity is one of them. Sanctity is another one. So, um, and conservatives tend to, based on his research, and this is backed up by actual hard research, um, that they use all six kind of evenly, whereas on the liberal mindset, it's more just those two, care and fairness, with maybe some liberty thrown in, but mostly the care and fairness principle.
I think you can see the purity axis in there too at times,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
um, but yeah, I mean, you can really see that if you frame looking at the subject in terms of the institutional side was on the care harm axis, and the anti-institutional side was on the um the freedom, and what was the other one you had listed two there
well,
that
if
would
liberty
complementary.
and authority
Yeah.
was one, and authority versus insubordination, basically.
Uh-huh.
Um, care harm, liberty versus oppression, sanctity, and purity. Those are the primary ones. I think you're
Okay.
probably thinking of the loyalty. Loyalty
Well,
is another one
yeah.
as well.
So yeah, I mean, and you can apply that in different ways, and there are different, positions on the spectrum, but it really fundamentally broke down to care harm
Right.
versus freedom oppression.
And I have a personal story that I wanted to share about this, because this is a little mea culpa on my side, on my part, personally, that I realized as I was looking at this through this framework, right, and through our framework and through our discussion. I've kind of came to a realization that I did something really wrong in my reaction at the time. Um, so I had a cousin, and this is fortunately, I think, the only person in my extended family that I know of who died as a during the pandemic as a result of the the virus and of the disease. I had a cousin whose husband died, and at the time when I heard about it, I love my cousin. I loved her since she was just a little tiny thing. She was a good bit younger than me. Um, and it really made me mad. I mean, I got angry about it,
Hmm.
and I was morally offended by the fact, because he wasn't vaccinated, right? And I don't believe he was, and I've saw some of the posts and things that they were pretty defiant about their concern for what they saw as kind of a tyrannical government overreach, right? Which a lot of people felt, not just them, obviously, but and a lot of people still do. But I blamed him for leaving her and her children without a father, right?
Right.
And I really blamed him for it. I made a post on social media. Now, I didn't mention him or her by name, right? I didn't, but I did really kind of express my moral outrage about this and how selfish I thought it was. And
And
at the
and
time, I thought I was doing something good. I thought I was basically trying to say, look, don't do this. Don't do this to your family. Don't do this. Get out there and get a vaccine.
and
I didn't realize that how they had interpreted it from their moral framework, right? And that was not fair. I was wrong in doing that. And some of my cousins actually took me to task for it. And at the time, I was defensive about it, but now I see that they were right.
and and I'm sure that they would appreciate you, at this point, acknowledging that. And to give a little bit of benefit of the doubt there, I mean, you had a personal story like that there were plenty of public stories the same way, where there were plenty of people that were making that moralistic post, whether they knew anyone who had actually been in that position or not.
Right.
You know,
Right.
there were
Exactly.
plenty of news stories that you could cite of, oh, they came out as anti-vaccine and now they died. Look what you get. You know,
Right. Right. Yeah. And by the way, that is as much a a reaffirmation internally for them, for people who are saying that, right? They're kind of trying to reassure themselves very often that they're on the right side, right? And that they're doing the right thing, right? Because it was confusing and it was scary, right? And none of us, I don't think, actually really knew what the right things to do were. We all had to just kind of figure it out along the way. And we know that now
right.
in
But
hindsight.
it's, it's part of, and this goes back into the research that I did on, cult dynamics. And I mean, I kind of hate using that term because it's such a loaded term, but it's an area of study that shows how people get grouped into belief ideas and then, interact with the world through that lens. And that's one of the aspects of that, is that it's self-affirming behavior that, it's ritualistic behavior that you do these things to, it's on multiple levels. It's to confirm your position in the group. It's to reassure yourself that you're on the moral side of things. The variety of different reasons that they do that, but that's part of that structure. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And you know, this is where it also comes back to that idea of factual claims versus value-based claims, and there's even a third one of interpretive-based claims, right? Because we can basically try to make a factual claim that masks are either effective or ineffective, and try to show the data and show the empirical um, information that backs up one argument over the other one, right? But then when we get to the point of, well, they should be mandated, that's a value claim, right? That's different. That's not necessarily based on the facts, because then you also have to. The school closures is a better example of this, right? Because nobody can deny now, in hindsight, that the school closures caused a lot of harm for children, right? And there's just no way around that. I mean, you brought up the idea of the whole point, and reminded me of the history of the Great Barrington Declaration, where these three scientists from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard wrote a letter basically warning about these harms. This was back in
Yep.
like what,
Fringe
October of
unqualified
2020.
idiots.
Yeah, exactly. And but we know now that all the things that they warned about came true, right? Things like lower childhood vaccination rates. And by the way, even Fauci admitted later that he was worried that the vaccine mandate, and he admitted that he thought that it was very possible and very likely, in fact, that the vaccine mandate itself would cause blowback and cause maybe perhaps less people to get vaccinated in the end than might have otherwise if they hadn't forced everybody to, right?
Right.
We know that it definitely, there were fewer people getting cancer screenings, right, because of the lockdowns. There were deteriorating mental health. There's all kinds of research on the mental health aspects, particularly for kids. But also in the school closures, we know for a fact that there were kids that just did not learn as much as they would have. There were deficits in their schooling, right, in their education, that would not have been there had the schools remained open
There's
for that entire.
even deeper than that. There are deficits in their development. I mean, you
Right.
lost years
Social
of being
development.
able
Yeah.
to read faces and understand language. I mean, there are people that are, I think it's fair to use the term developmentally disabled at this point. Their development was stunted, like, permanently, because of what happened. And this is something that I was banging my head against a wall at the time. And I want to say a couple things. I had talked last time. I had laid out kind of my thinking on epistemology, and kind of what I had determined or looked at based on my experience as like a good form of epistemology. I'm not trying to imply that I know necessarily anything more than anybody else, or that I'm, you know, have some kind of virtue in that. I was just trying to say that this is what has been my understanding of how we learn. So if you can apply that process, you know, it's the same as like going to college. And you know, so I'm not necessarily trying to advance the idea here that I knew necessarily more than anybody else going in, but that was one of the things that was, you know, I was banging my head against a wall on, is like, you're not looking at the costs on these types of things. And it goes back to my cost benefit analysis on, you know, this is not free. There are going to be costs to be paid on it. You know, there's a downside.
Right. And again, this is why our toolkit is so important, because it gives us these tools to be able to look at these claims and say, well, wait a minute, that's a value claim. Let's explore that as a value claim, right? When we say that we need to have these lockdowns, right? We say, okay, well, what's the reason for the lockdown? We have to look at it and say, okay, well, the reason we say for the lockdown is because if people go out into the public together and interact with each other, they're going to spread the disease, right? That was the idea. We wanted to lock down the disease and let it die off and before we go back out and mingle. But if we do that and try to pretend that it's a factual claim, right? Then we're missing the value part of the question, which is, well, what's the trade-off? What's the cost of that, right? Let's do a cost-benefit analysis of exactly what is going to happen if we do this, right? I mean, are we going to have a mental health epidemic instead of a disease epidemic, right? You know,
Right.
are we going to, you know, cause people to, like I said, miss their cancer screening and end up with a worse disease because they didn't get to see the doctor for a year, right? I actually had another personal story on that. I had a temporary filling put in right before the lockdown, and I was
Uh-huh.
supposed to get a root canal. I didn't get the root canal for over a year, right? So I had this like temporary filling in my tooth.
Well,
Tooth is gone now, but you know,
I haven't talked to my family, but I think there's a legitimate case to be made that my mom basically can't walk now because of COVID, because shortly, like right as it was beginning to start, she had a knee replacement surgery. So she was able to get in for that surgery before they shut the medical thing down. But it was 2023 or something before she had the other knee done.
okay, okay,
And and I mean, I don't know that you can hold that
yeah,
directly.
right.
I think that the
Well, it
way,
certainly didn't help anything, right?
well, she ended up with an infection, and then she ended up with, you know, bone fragility, and, you know, she had to have a rod through her heel, and, you know, now she's got a lot of struggles on that. She spent a lot of time in the hospital subsequent to that, because she had, you know, antibiotic resistant infections and that type of thing. But I think there's an argument that could be made that had she had the damage not gotten to the level that it was, had she been able to have that surgery
Right.
sooner,
She'd be in a better
she
state
didn't
now.
have all of
Yep.
those complications the first time. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, that's the importance of why we need to be able to identify these claims as for what they are, right? Because we need to be able to ask these questions. And we need to be able to also go back and say, okay, well, you know, maybe we did make some mistakes because, you know, one of the other parts that people really had a problem with early on was any type of idea that was counter to the official narrative, especially when it came to how bad the disease actually was, right? In terms of numbers. You know, I think early on, the CDC was and other organizations around the world actually were estimating that the mortality rate for infected people uh, was as high as 2 to 4%, right?
right.
Of people who get it are going to die. Well, that's a huge number. I mean, that when you extrapolate that to the about 5 billion people, right? That ended up, we think, being
Contracting the disease.
infected,
Yeah.
contract,
Yeah.
well, just even being
Exposed to it.
exposed to it and catching it, even if they didn't ever have any symptoms or show any signs of the disease, right? 5 billion people, that's a lot of people. And 2%, even 2% of 5 billion people, right, is a
Uh-huh.
huge number. We're talking about, 100 million people, right? And we didn't see, of course, anywhere near that level of death. It was actually closer to about 7 million, right? Totally worldwide, about 1.2 million, they think, officially anyway, in the United States. I even use those numbers with a bit of a caveat, because even those numbers have a lot of nuance to them, right? We have to really look at those objectively and understand that, based on whatever kind of methodology we use, the whole, there's, lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? Um, so we have to be very careful there too. But still, 7 million from 5 billion is a much lower number, closer to like 0.15%, where I think most of the estimates are coming out now.
Yeah, 0.15 is what I was reading when, and I think that was the research that you had put up.
But there were
Which,
people that were coming up with that number back then in 2020. The
right.
problem was that because they were part of the heterodoxy and everything had become so polarized and so political and so dogmatized, that those people were, like John Ioannidis or whatever. I mean, there are some issues that are very valid about his methodologies and things, but he was just shouted down, right, and completely ignored and shunned, really.
That goes back
For
to
even suggesting it.
the Great Barrington Declaration, which we talked about. That came out in October of 2020, so
October
it was a few
2020,
months
right?
in. But you had, Dr.
Still
Jay
during the lockdown.
Bhattacharya,
Yep.
who is an epidemiologist at Stanford. People talk about people lacking qualification. This is what he does. And he's like, no, you guys are getting this wrong. And he was
And
one of
Oxford and
those
Harvard
that
too. Yeah. Yep.
the two people that he worked with on that, one was from Oxford, and one was from Harvard. So, I mean, they're hacks from little known institutions. Um, but and they put that out, and he was one of the ones that came up with that figure. It was like, no, you're looking at this, we're vastly underestimating the number of people that have been exposed. When you look, and he had scientific things,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
wasn't pulling stuff out of his butt. He was, looking at research to come up with that. So,
Well, as I understand it, one of the problems with the 2 to 4% number was that they were really only looking at, like you said, only those people that were
confirmed
confirmed
cases.
cases, right?
Yeah.
So, and if that number is an order, as far as people that were actually infected, an order of magnitude higher, then all those numbers change radically, right? And significantly. And they change the value judgment assessment, right? They change, because if you're going to say 50 million people are going to die, that's one thing. If you're going to say 5 million people, we don't want 5 million people to die. That's already a much higher number than what we get with just the standard flu, right? So, and I mean, it's not that it's not serious.
Uh-huh.
It's that it doesn't go to the level of the types of policies that were being, that arguably, this is the argument, right? That doesn't rise to the level of the policies that were being
Well,
implemented.
and if you look at that in the context of, kind of the utilitarian idea, and, I frequently go back to the idea of the trolley problem. Um, even if you take the largest of those estimates, I mean, if you're looking at 4%, 4%, if 100
Huge
people
number.
get it, 4 people die.
Right.
So you want to lock everybody in their home, take away their livelihood, deal with the mental health, to save 4 people out of 100. It's like there is a cost. That what's the benefit compared to the cost? So, that, and it gets morbid to start talking about things in those terms, but and that's where you get people being able to really manipulate that depending on what point they want to make. Because if you throw
Sure.
out a number like, well, it's 0.15%, it's like, oh, that's nothing. But that's going to be 7 million people. Oh, that's huge.
Right. Right. It is a perspective thing. But, but the bigger problem, I think, that we'll both agree on, and what we can use our toolkit to avoid, is that the polarization preventing us from even having the discussion about it. Right. I mean, because if we can't even discuss these things objectively and actually test these ideas without fear of being run out of town, right, then we're in a very dangerous situation. And it's going to cause people to be hurt and die as a result if we can't actually really discuss the truth and get to the truth together.
Yeah, the reason to look at this, the real reason, people want to do this. Say, I was right. No, I was right. The real reason to look at this is because we need to be able to evaluate what happened to make determinations on what to do next time.
Absolutely, because there will be a next time, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think we all know that, right? I mean, epidemics and disease are part of the human experience and always have been and always will be. Now we're getting better at being able to treat them, fortunately. Not always in a straight line progression, right? But we're certainly better than we were a few hundred years ago, right? I mean, I don't think anybody's going to argue that against that point.
Right.
Um, but I mean, at the same time, we also have to approach these things. And that's why our toolkit, one of the primary things that it demands is intellectual humility, right?
Yes.
Because if you don't come from an intellectually humble position of, here's something I don't know, I want to eliminate any reasoning that tries to push me in one direction or another because I want that to be true, right? Motivated reasoning. And that leads to confirmation bias, both at the individual and group levels, right? And all of the logical fallacies that we talk about that we want to avoid, and what our toolkit is designed to help us avoid. Um, and we need to be able to approach that with that humility to say, okay, well, what is true, and what can I show is true and agree on across the board is true.
Yeah, we really need to be approaching it from the perspective of I want to find the right answer instead of I have the right answer.
Right. Right. Exactly. And that means that we have to work all the tools that we talk about, things like steel manning the other position to try to see if, or reversing the thing and seeing if what it would take for us to convince ourselves that we're wrong, right? What, like, if I didn't think that if I thought everybody should have to take the vaccine, well, what would it take for me to say no, maybe not? Right? I need to know what that is, right? To be able to go in, because if I find that that's more likely the case, then I have to be, and that's the other part of intellectual humility, I have to be willing to change my position,
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, you can take that back a level and, you need to say what would it take to move from the position of everyone should have the vaccine to everyone has to take the vaccine.
Right. 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 And being able to make that distinction between the, you know, the factual, and the ought,
Hmm. Right.
right? The
Right.
value, right? Exactly. Yeah. And and what this ends up then is that we have to also be ready for what we call in our toolkit calibrated uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
Something where we can say, you know, the deepest toolkit failure in using COVID was the treatment of uncertainty on all sides, right? We didn't even allow ourselves on either side to leave room for uncertainty.
That was one of the criticisms that my analysis made of, of both sides, but it pointed that out on the institutional side that there was a conscious decision made to advance a an exaggerated position of certainty on things that were widely recognized to that we really don't have certainty on. And the conclusion from that was that that was detrimental to the whole process because we'd have been a lot better off if they'd have just come out and said, look, we don't know, but this is
We
what
don't
we
know.
think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that dogmatization, right, of both position and policy, just push people further into their camps, right? And if you were for it, you made it even more morally right that you had to be for it. And if you were against it, then you just had to dig your heels in even harder and say, no, I'm against it.
Yeah, it
So
all just reinforced those, competing Manichaean perspectives.
right, exactly.
So I think we're getting ready to wrap up here soon.
Yep.
If you don't mind, I would like to then, I started off with kind of the opening of the analysis that I did. I'd like to read the conclusion,
Yeah, please
as kind of a
go
way
for
to
it.
go out.
Yep.
So the most honest conclusion from applying the framework to COVID is simultaneously disturbing and clarifying. Both the institutional mainstream and the anti-institutional opposition exhibited the cultic and Manichaean dynamics we've been describing. Both got significant things wrong. Both were shaped by the same underlying social forces. The constitutive opposition, which is the concept that we've talked about, where you define your group by who you're
Right.
against.
I hear you're against.
Um,
Exactly.
the in-group, out-group identity mechanisms, the Manichaean structure, with the polarity reversed, but the structure identical. The people who navigated COVID most epistemically well were generally those who maintained calibrated uncertainty rather than framework certainty,
Absolutely.
applied consistent evidentiary standards regardless of source, refused the moral identity package deals on both sides, updated their positions as evidence evolved, and maintained genuine relationships across the political and epistemic divides. These are not easy cognitive achievements. They required active resistance to enormous social pressure from multiple directions, but they are achievable. And identifying them as achievable is itself important because both institutional and anti institutional Manichaean frameworks wanted to make you believe that the only alternative to their framework was the darkness on the other side.
Right. Right.
The existence of people who navigated the epistemic minefield with genuine integrity, and there were many, across the political spectrum in both mainstream and heterodox communities, is the empirical falsification of the Manichaean claim that you had to choose a side and accept its entire package.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
the final sentence here, I've built a project with all of our in Claude of all of our transcripts and that type of thing. So Claude likes to conclude his analysis with a nod back to us. So the final sentence here is that falsification is what asynchrony at its best keeps demonstrating.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And on that note,
Yes, sir.
yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to keep this going and we're going to talk about more specific issues like this and try to figure out the best ways to handle these issues and keep ourselves honest, and also the best ways that we can develop methods to actually find the truth, right? Because that really is our ultimate goal here. Please do hit that like button and subscribe to our podcast. We're on all the major platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. So there's no excuse to miss your Asynchrony podcast. So also share it around. If you find people that you think would benefit from learning about these tools and these ways of addressing very difficult and complex subjects, and are wanting to bridge the divide between them and their other family members or friends, then please do share these videos with your friends as well. And we appreciate all the comments, and please keep those coming as also. Well, Dean, we've made it through another one, and we're going to keep it going next week and keep this conversation going.
So we talked about COVID, and we're apparently still speaking to each other. So there's hope.
The toolkit
All right.
works.
Yep, it does.
All right. Until next time.
All right. Talk to you next week.